You can also pay to play, right? You can pay to set up fake accounts. There's an entire search engine optimization industry of fake accounts, seasoned accounts, Instagram followers, Twitter followers. All of these things are designed to mimic social movements in a lot of ways, mimic organic activity, mimic interest in order to manipulate the platforms. We have to make that illegal. We have to. Like, that is not free speech in the public interest. And so that, to me, that industry and that way in which social media and the way in which it's structured in order to deliver information to you is fundamentally flawed and broken, and we must take out the ways in which people can pay to play.
Drawing upon Forum Network partnerships and access to speakers, these events will bring together experts in different fields with reporters from WGBH News. Over the next year, these forums will teach you more about how election polling works, discuss the polarization of voters, and unpack the Massachusetts ballot questions. And tonight, we'll be joined by a distinguished panel of experts who are going to take a deep dive into how we consume election coverage during an age of disinformation. It's my pleasure to introduce you to this evening's panel. Joan Donovan is director of the Technology and Social Change Research Project at the Harvard Shorenstein Center. Dr. Donovan leads the field in examining internet and technology studies, online extremism, media manipulation, and disinformation campaigns. Christi Farrar is a consultant at the Massachusetts Library System. She provides continuing education and support to MLS member libraries across the Commonwealth. Prior to working at MLS, Farrar worked as a children's and teen librarian in Massachusetts public libraries. And Dr. David Lazar is a professor of political science and computer and information science at Northeastern University and co-director for the new lab for text map and networks. Prior to joining Northeastern University, he was on the faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School and director of its program on networked governance. And Laura Colarusso is the digital managing editor here at WGBH News. She oversees the newsroom's digital strategy, coordinates breaking news coverage, and edits everything from feature stories to video packages. Prior to joining WGBH, Laura was a member of the Boston Globe's editorial board and a reporter at Newsweek. And she also writes The Thread, which is WGBH News' weekly newsletter, bringing you the latest reporting from our newsroom. So please welcome our distinguished panel to the stage.
I've been really excited about this panel tonight. I think following the 2016 election, there was no question that misinformation and disinformation played a role, and 2020 is probably just going to become more urgent. I think much of the narrative has centered around Russian trolls and the IRA and those types of groups, but tonight I want to look forward a little bit. The 2020 election, there are predictions now about more state actors, non-state actors coming from America, coming from Iran, coming from China. We're looking to influence the way that we think about the candidates and what's important to us. So some of the predictions include things like digital voter suppression being ramped up, more for-profit firms spreading misinformation, disinformation, WhatsApp and Instagram being key platforms that these actors will be targeting. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to the panel. It's a light topic, and I'm sure we'll come to a complete solution by the end of the hour. But so let's get started because we have a lot of room to cover, or a lot of distance to cover. So I wanted to start with Joan tonight. I think it's really important that we sort of define the issue and define what it is that we're talking about. So, Joan, if you could walk us through what is disinformation, misinformation, fake news, and how they're different.
Yeah, hello everybody. It's really great to be here. Thank you for having me. So obviously we want to know what it is that we're talking about when we talk about disinformation or misinformation. And those two words sound a lot alike, but what is different about them from our research perspective is really about the intent. So with misinformation, you might share something and unintentionally share a study that says, drinking a whole bottle of wine at night is really good for your health. And it might conform to some biases that you have, but, research is out there. So, but you unintentionally share it. You're not trying to harm anyone. Disinformation is different. It actually even looks different when we study it online because the idea is to trick people into sharing things. So it's not just the case that someone is out there spreading information and they don't really care what happens. They're actually taking different kinds of steps to make sure you and you and you and you see it, especially reporters see it, so that it travels further and faster and makes an impact. And so disinformation usually has political gain at the end of it. This is different from maybe online fraud where someone's trying to get you wrapped up in a scam, they're trying to get your credit card number. Disinformation tends to have a political outcome in mind, and the people who are using disinformation are actually manipulating the platforms and the features of the platforms to spread that information, which is why things like Twitter and Facebook become really important vectors to study, because these are the places where we go to get information, and anyone in our networks could foreseeably share disinformation and not necessarily be considered a disinformation agent, but they're part of that bigger process, and platforms are part of that. The fake news question is an interesting one for us as researchers, because that's something that we hear politicians use sort of as a cudgel against one another. You're fake news, this one's fake news. We know there's one particular person who's fake news, right? And when we think about that as researchers, we tend to shy away from words like that because they're not easy to measure, they're not scientific. So we do rely heavily, though, on definitions of misinformation and disinformation to make assessments about what the impact is and what the potential political fallout is going to be. But this could also apply to medical misinformation or anything that you need information to make a decision about in your life.
Just real quick to follow up on that, can you give us a sense of who is pushing the disinformation? What kind of people are we talking about?
So this ranges broadly, the things that we've seen related to Russia meddling in U.S. elections, that is true and real. But also we see online marketers, people who have ostensibly news websites that are looking to make a quick buck. So there's lots of clickbait out there. As well, there's what we might call trolls. So these are people that like to cause chaos, and their outcome doesn't necessarily have to be one candidate is elected and the other one is not, but that everyone is upset. And so we try to understand intent by the different pieces of media that they share and what the potential outcome and fallout might be.
Okay, David, let's talk about the scope of the problem. How widespread is this? Let's start there.
Well, there are a few things to think about in this respect, in absolute terms and then in relative terms. And unfortunately, the answer is we're really not sure, right? And I say that as someone who spends a lot of his life trying to study this topic, that we can point to lots of content out there that fits the descriptions of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, et cetera. But and there have been some efforts. I had a paper out last year trying to examine how much fake news was out there, which we defined as content that tried to look like legitimate news content, but was manufactured. And we found that the amount was, there was a non-trivial amount, maybe 5% of the content on Twitter around the election in 2016 fit that description, but that went to a very narrow audience. It primarily went to around 1% of users on Twitter, and there to a very focused set of actually older Republicans was the sort of particular demographics consuming the information. But that's only one slice of the broader misinformation problem. I don't think we have a really good measure of how large the problem is. The other thing I will say, and this is a somewhat more optimistic take, is I'm not sure the situation was ever that good, even pre-internet. So we tend to think about, let's make news great again, if you'll forgive the term. But that there are a lot of issues in terms of what was covered and how it was covered in the news media, say 20 years ago, and various kinds of manipulation of the news that existed over the decades. Indeed, the term fake news first emerged, I think, in the 30s and 40s around worries around news manipulation of the mainstream news, of the newspapers in particular. There was a TV guide issue, front cover, on fake news in the 1990s. It was about TV programs that were masquerading as legitimate news. So the good news here is that things were never that great.
Point taken. But social media is pushing these bits of misinformation around probably faster and farther than they would have traveled before. So what does that mean for the upcoming election?
So there's two things. And one thing to say, what is clearly different is that the internet, as a principle, creates a publishing platform where anyone can write something that the world can see, right? That just wasn't really there before the internet. And that's both a miraculous thing sometimes and a terrible thing sometimes. And what that also means is that it is possible to insinuate into an information ecosystem from any place in the world to any other place in the world. And so that does create that potential, and the social media has that the possibility that things published in a particular corner get picked up, manipulating the kinds of algorithmic amplification that you see on Facebook and Twitter, that creates a whole new avenue for inaccurate information. So I think the potential in 2020 is quite considerable. I don't think we have very good defenses for it. I think what we have is largely privatized. I don't think the government has done a lot. I don't think we have proper infrastructure to even evaluate the scale of the problem.
Okay. All right, Christi, following that. I want to talk about how this problem manifests itself on the consumer end. So we've been talking about the producers of this misinformation and disinformation. What do you see when you're working with people?
Well, obviously, people are concerned. We have a full house today. And if you're like me or like people that we work with in libraries, there's a sense of being overwhelmed. There's all this information out there. How do I get through it? How do I understand what's real, what's not real? And to the point where you get to kind of saturation level and just feel numb to it all, and that's when you can stop caring. And I think that on the librarian side and the library side, those of us who work with people day to day who are concerned about making sure that they're finding accurate information is how do we help people? Because generally that's what we think. We need to teach everybody how to find fake news. Unfortunately, that's not the solution. We have tools. We'll give you tools. It's not all doom and gloom. But it's not just about everybody learning how to be a better news consumer, because it's not your fault. There are definitely things that you can learn and move toward, but there's a lot of information out there.
Mm-hmm. So are there sort of themes to questions that you get from people seeking advice?
So I hear at the Massachusetts Library System, we work with libraries and librarians and schools. And I hear a lot from schools and academic librarians that they're worried about the younger generations. And a lot of the research is done on that. There was actually, just last week, the National Education Association published an article about a Stanford University study that was done in November of 2019. That despite all the efforts that we've done on media literacy, that students still can't differentiate between real and fake news online. And I would say, I think that's true for many of us adults as well. And that's just because it's getting so good at hiding. And so I think that the concerns we hear from individuals who are coming in are like, how can I know if I'm sharing fake news, or what should I do, or should I just get off the internet completely? And then from librarians, how do we teach people to differentiate?
To add to that, as someone who also works in education and One of these tactics of being an imposter website were actually pioneered by American white supremacists who bought up the keyword of Martin Luther King Jr. and operated a website about Martin Luther King Jr. for decades now. And so even when students are trying to do, a little internet report on civil rights movement, this is the information they encounter more so than any other information that is true and correct. And so one of the big vulnerabilities that the research tries to understand is the openness, and what is the vulnerability there when anyone can purchase, a domain name and operate it without those kinds of guidelines and rules in place. We're really at a disadvantage.
And if I could just add to that, one of the other things is the internet is a platform for publishing, and it's also a platform of platforms. And so so many websites have that capacity for anyone to publish content. So if you look at a website like Amazon, the fraction of reviews that are somehow gamed or manipulated is certainly very high, right? If you go even to a website like WebMD, which generally has legit content, it has products on there which have reviews. And so if you go to something like apricot seeds, a non-cure for cancer, but like which is one of those health hoaxes online, it gets a 4.7 rating on WebMD, right? Because WebMD is not curating the reviews for apricot seeds. And so what we see is this platform of platforms, and it creates all these entry points for manipulation. And part of the question, part of the challenges for the platforms is, well, for society is what's the interest in what are our tools for affecting what the platforms do? And then the challenge for the platforms is, given that they're built on these scalable models of millions and billions of transactions every day, how can they possibly curate the quality of the information?
And on the topic of curation, that's actually one of the areas where librarians can come in. Mm-hmm. That's what we do, is curate information, and we select tools like online databases and books and ebooks, and it's not perfect, but it is at least a smaller set of information from which to choose. It makes it much easier. Plus, then you have the expert, the librarian, and see if there are any Harry Potter fans in here. When in doubt, go to the library. That's one of the things that you can do.
Sure. I thought it'd be useful tonight to walk through a few examples, and so if we could move to the first slide. This is at Polite Melanie. She is a troll. She's from Russia, I believe. And so I was hoping first what we could do is, I'll give people just a couple of seconds to read through, if you can see what she said. And so I wanted to start with Joan. Let's talk about how you would... Let's talk about how you would define this.
So one of the things I wrote last year was an op-ed for the New York Times about how white supremacists often impersonate Black women, Black feminists even, because you see someone like that online, you see an image of a Black woman, you might have some internal bias, either believing them or questioning them. Whatever that bias is, they are trying to activate something within you to get you to think differently. And then in the course of a piece of social media like this, of course, it's made to say, oh, that these conservative Christians are somehow unable to know what is the difference between a Homo sapien and a homosexual. So, funny, right? But this is like, imagine if this was a constant barrage of things you were ingesting over the course of a day that were really meant to wedge how you feel about conservative Christians, really meant to make you think negatively about them. Right? And this is the way in which identity is played out online, where we can never really know who it is that we're interacting with unless we know them through our known networks. And we have to think about ways of vetting different kinds of people beyond even things that are just the Twitter check mark or a Facebook check mark, because ultimately disinformation does have this component of there is some kind of imposter-ness going on here. It's literally meant to trick you. And so it's not just a matter of being savvy or pointing out, oh, well, this must be untrue. It's also about getting down to, well, what's happening in the account itself, and is this account trying to make me think a specific way about a particular issue?
Can we just drill down a bit on the intent of this actor? Because my sense is, and what I've read, is that they're trying to get you to agree with them to sort of hook you in, and there's sort of an emotional response they're hoping that you're going to have. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the things we've become accustomed to over the last decade, it's kind of crazy to realize that we've only had about 20 years of social media, but in the last decade we've seen an adoption of social media to widespread audiences. And the intent of a page like this is what in my field we call seeding the ground. So you're actually planting seeds around so that people will follow it, will start to gain trust in it. And then when it does switch into political disinformation, you're already bought in.
David, how does something like this get introduced into the social media ecosystem?
Well, I think Joan's point is spot on, which is there is a basic authenticity issue with the internet. We don't have validated identities. I think perhaps the most insightful thing, per word at least, that's ever been written about the internet was a cartoon published in 1993. Which was a picture of a dog by the computer talking to another dog, saying, the great thing about the internet is that nobody knows you're a dog, right? And that was remarkably prescient, right? It was meant to be cute. It wasn't really meant to be a devastating critique of the internet. It was just meant to make you chuckle. But in fact, actually, that is really the key to understanding the contemporary internet, that nobody knows that this is actually a Russian in disguise. Mm-hmm. And so I think the intent here is to find those fissures clearly, if you look at the body of Russian tweets, it would appear that the objective was to find those fissures in U.S. society and drill into it and increase divisiveness in U.S. society. I will say it's unclear how much that added to our own capacity to do that by ourselves. Mm-hmm. That in fact the fraction of all content about politics that was from IRA accounts is really actually quite tiny, and there was a paper out. Although I think any scholarship in this area has to be replicated many times. But there was a paper out in the Journal of Proceedings of the National Academy of Science that was looking at people exposed to IRA accounts that did not find evidence of polarization. And so again, I think there's a clear strategic effort to divide our society. I think that we are more divided, but the trends there way predate the internet, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it has to do with a lot of tectonic social changes around urban, regional, urban, country, changes in a lot of facets of our economy, of our society, that isn't about it's being reflected here. But clearly the effort here is to accentuate those divisions.
Right. Well, what's the life cycle of something like this? Because I'm looking at these numbers, over 98,000 retweets and close to 308,000 likes.
We have to be careful, if I just up here, we have to be very careful about interpreting these numbers, mm-hmm. Because, and this is one of the challenges of studying misinformation, because even our understanding of the misinformation is being manipulated, because part of the effort is to make it look bigger than it really is. In part it's to manipulate the platforms, but it's also in part to manipulate the news media to report stories. Oh my gosh, it's been liked 300,000 times. But maybe that's been by 300,000 bots, right? It's very easy to pump up the numbers. And so the answer here is, on the one hand, clearly it scratches an itch It's very satisfying. This kind of content is very satisfying to certain people. So clearly some of this content really does spread widely, and the nature of these things is they spread very quickly and then they stop spreading. But then it's on to the next tweet, which may spread. But we have to be very careful about interpreting these numbers as representations of what real eyeballs have seen as compared to fake eyeballs.
But I think this also plays into why it's important that we understand journalism differently today, which is that journalists are both our best defense against disinformation, but also the most noxious amplifiers. And there are some journalists who are trafficking in this information at the same time that they're getting, major profits from it. And then there's other journalists who are trying to do a good job and ignore these kinds of things that happen because you don't want Twitter to be your assigning editor. But at the same time, it's a very, very difficult dance that journalists are doing in this age of new media.
Right, because if something's trending and you don't report on it, then that's a part of the problem. Then you are missing out.
Not at WGBH News.
No, of course not. No.
And if I could just give one example here, because I think that's right, and it's such a difficult juggling act, right? But also there's the effort to, if you have great content on social media, it's free content to recycle and reuse. And so I'll give you an example. Anyone remember the Covington Catholic boys and at the mall? And there was a Twitter account that circulated a very cleverly edited 1 minute that made it look particularly awful, right? The account was called @Fight2020. And we have a data set which allows how much people are actually engaging with this account. And it turns out, actually tons of people were, even though this was not a huge account, 50,000 followers. But we figured around 2% of Democrats in the country actually were exposed, actually not exposed, but retweeted or liked content from this account, which is remarkable for an account that had a modest number of followers. And we said, why is that? And we realized that it had a bunch of clever, let's say this is clever, knockdowns on President Trump, for example. Anyone see the picture of Trump at a kindergarten seemingly miscoloring an American flag, right? So that was one that was circulated by this Twitter account. Now, that got republished by the Washington Post, right? And that then created this incredible spike of attention for that account and for that tweet. And then tweets like that also then got cited by the Washington Times to say, look how crazy progressives are, right? That they're so obsessed with Trump. And so it scratched an itch that progressives like, and then it scratched an itch that could make fun of progressives on the conservative side. And so this was exactly the kind of media-based, and it's not clear whether this was a fake account or, there was a lot of questionable stuff about it. It's very hard to tell sometimes. But it was exactly this, it ended up really, truly amplifying the reach of this account. And that's troubling.
Right. Well, let's move on to a couple more examples. We have some video examples. All right, this is about video manipulation. So we're going to watch 2 videos. The first one is Emma Gonzalez. She was one of the Parkland shooting survivors. You may remember this, but she did a photo shoot with Teen Vogue, where there is actually a video where she ripped a target, and it was manipulated to look like she was ripping the Constitution. And then the second one is Nancy Pelosi. This one is a little bit more recent, where the origin of this video is unclear, but it got retweeted by a conservative site called Politics Watchdog, and then it was retweeted by Rudy Giuliani, and it had more than 2 million views before it was pulled. So let's take a look at these, and then we can go through them. So there's the first one.
We want to give this president the opportunity to do something historic for our country. While there are those in our family who think, why would you work with him if he, and basically he's saying back to me, why would I work with you if you're investigating me? But the fact is, something happened there. We want to give this president the opportunity to do something historic for our country. While there are those in our family who think, why would you work with him if he, and basically he's saying back to me, why would I work with you if you're investigating me? But the fact is, something happened there.
So Joan, I mean, like we've touched on before, this isn't new. How does this fit into sort of the range of what's been done before, and what's the technology here?
Yeah, so there are ways in which, I mean, we've been living with Photoshop a really long time now, and some people probably even remember when Xerox copiers were used to create some fun headlines in the old break room and things. But when you use media in order to impersonate someone, and it looks as real as something like this with Emma Gonzalez, and I'll have you note, they didn't just tweak the video, they also changed the way her, tweak the rip, they also changed the way her face looked. You know, they changed her ears, they made her nose bigger, they changed her complexion. And then this was circulated on the morning of, the night before in the morning of the very large March for Our Lives protest in March. And this was something that these students had planned. It was, in DC, there were marches around the country. But instead, what's dominating the social media feeds, of this sort of splintered world that we're living in, are coverage of this, and people are circulating this, saying that she would rather rip up the Constitution than be a good citizen, right? And then, but this was all done with cheap editing software. This wasn't something that was what we call a deep fake, which is it was generated using algorithms and machine learning. Instead, this was people on a message board who had a lot of time to spare that were helping each other spot any of the imperfections. As well, I've studied the Pelosi video here. All they did was slow it 75%. So you're watching a video played at 75%, which makes her look inebriated. So these kinds of forgeries we call cheap fakes because they're cheap to do and they move really fast. The one thing we know about news online is that it can go viral when it's novel. And so to have a novel piece of information that no one else has, people will share it very quickly. And so one of the things that manipulators leverage is the attention to an issue, the timing of that issue, and then also the distribution, sort of the context of the distribution itself. So if you can get someone newsworthy like Giuliani to tweet about it, then the story moves beyond, some anonymous account that we don't know much about made this thing into, look, Rudy Giuliani sharing fake news, right? And that's how that stuff starts to scale really rapidly.
David, what's the danger here?
Well, we don't know. I mean, the issue is, there's been, as I noted earlier, misinformation forever. So like if we were looking at news coverage of World War I, and it was really in part out of the coverage of World War I and the Spanish-American War that a lot of what we think of as the goal of objectivity in modern news media emerged, that you would see pictures of bodies, of mutilated bodies, where the assertion was that that was the result of German atrocities in World War I, right? It was just completely fabricated the pictures were real, but they're recontextualized in part with British input. And so is this worse than that? I don't know, but it might be, right? We don't really quite fully understand the mechanisms by which people integrate this into their belief systems, into their emotional reactions. And so part of the question, and like I said, we just don't really know, is how are we being reprogrammed, and how are our understandings of the world and our emotional reactions to things being reprogrammed by being exposed to information in this form, which is a different kind of form than, let's say, misinformation in the 19th century, which wouldn't have had images at all, but just would have been words, but there was pretty extreme misinformation that circulated in the 19th century. We had no criteria about objective journalism then. And so the answer is there are definitely substantial dangers here, but we really don't know whether at the end of the day it's still going to be about having a source of information that curates the content well, and if you don't trust the curatorial capacities, it doesn't matter if it's a cheap fake, a deep fake, fake words, that it's all problematic unless we have institutions that we trust that properly curate the information.
One of the other questions I wanted to ask was about the responsibilities that the platforms have, Twitter and Facebook, YouTube. What responsibilities do they currently have, I guess legally, and what responsibilities should they have to police things like this, do you think?
Well, at the moment, the way the laws in the U.S. provides a fair amount of freedom in their decisions. Now, that said, laws can change. In particular, laws around the liability of what's on their platforms. Right now, they're really generally not liable. I do think, there are some legitimately tricky issues to wrestle with because the moment you start saying, here's speech that needs to be erased from the platforms, is you necessarily get into some troubling territory. And I'm happy to go further into that. But B, I also think clearly they have a duty to not be manipulated. Like if they're being played to amplify inauthentic speech, it's really hard to see how that accords with our understandings of what free speech is. And so clearly, I think there's a duty not to be manipulated, and yet it's not clear. It's in their interest sometimes, right? And that's part of why it's important to have a conversation, important to go to Congress, like Joan was testifying before Congress yesterday on this, to talk about the duties that the platforms really do have to not be played.
Right. So we're going to move on to another example here, because I want Christi to walk us through some best practices for verifying sources, and really to help us stop the spread of mis and disinformation. So let's start with the Queen.
So the Queen. When you're on social media, how many of you use Twitter? Does anybody? Well, a number of people. So this is from Twitter.
I follow back, Boston Joe.
One of the things that I always pay attention to is who's sending out that information. So here, with the user is BBC News UK. But if you look very closely, the comparison between the two different BBC News, one with the check mark, which is validated, not always correct. I mean, that's not always the only thing that you want to look for. But some accounts will just change one character or change the case. This one, it's BBC News UKI. And so it's easy to miss if you don't pay attention. The other thing that I always look for is, do I know anybody who follows this account? Is it an account that I'm familiar with and follow, and try not to pay attention to just the shares and the likes, because again, that can be manipulated. Yes, do we have it?
Yeah,
more? Yep.
Yes, we do have more.
So this one's even trickier. If you're looking at the news that you're seeing, following who posted it, are they a real person? This one, Alex, is really hard to find if they're a real person or not. But where are they posting it to? So do you know anything about that website, Infowars.com? I'm sure many of us have heard of that. But then what is the website URL? So that URL that's a little hard to see down there. Yeah, thank you. I wouldn't recommend that you go to it. Just if you search for it, do a Google search for it, or whatever browser that you're using, or search engine you're using, to find out if you can find information about that website. This one, actually, if you do go to it, does a pop-up that's trying to trick you into downloading an extension to your web browser. So again, be very aware. Don't just click on things or go to the websites, but try to find out more about it. And like this slide says, also be wary of icons that suggest authentication, because now that there is a way to say that this account is verified, people are trying to spoof that as well. And then down at the bottom, we have another post. That one's from Facebook, and it's it really is trying to play on your emotions. So the user account is impeach Trump. If you agree with that, then you may share it. If you disagree with it, you may share it or interact with it in some way. But if you can figure out who is posting it, what they're doing, and what is their mission, why are they doing that, that's really important. And then just stop and think. Are you reacting emotionally? And if you are, like actually if you were here in the beginning of the preview, one of the speakers from a previous news forum said if you're reacting emotionally, then that's something you need to think about. So stop and think and check your bias.
Right. So a lot of this sounds like putting context around the information,
absolutely.
around the news source, around the entity that is sharing it in the first place. So I know we have a slide about the SIFT test, and I was hoping you could walk the audience through this method of basically verifying what you're saying.
And use the word context. And Mike Caulfield, who came up with the SIFT test, he's at Washington State University. He actually says it's not enough for us to just identify fake news. We need to recontextualize it and understand where is it coming from and what does it do. The reality is most of us, when we're on social media and we're seeing headlines, or if, like me at midnight are scrolling through our news feed on Google News and just read the headlines, we're not doing a step-by-step checklist every single time. Nobody does that. But we want to have something that's a framework that is simple, easy to remember. And I really like Caulfield's SIFT method. So the S is for stop, and it's just stop, think about it. Again, check your bias, check your emotion. Also, don't hit share immediately or don't hit a reaction immediately until you understand more about what it is that you're looking at. And even if it just means you don't do anything, that's fine. You don't have to interact with every piece of information that's out there. The next, the I, investigate the source. See if you can find out more about what that source is, with a website, the person who's posting it. Do you know them? Do you know people who know them? Are they within your network? And then the F is find better coverage. For the example with Queen Elizabeth, if you had done a quick search, if you saw that in your newsfeed and you did a quick search, you would find lots and lots of articles about the Queen being dead. So if it's real news, it's going to be verified by another source. So go to a source that you trust. Go to WGBH. Go to somewhere that you know that you can trust the information and see if they can verify that news as well. And then the last one is if you really want to keep continuing down the rabbit hole and you have time, or you're just curious, or if, like me, family members send you a news article and ask you, is it real? Try to trace back to the original source. See if you can, if there's a quote or if there's a video, like the Nancy Pelosi video, see if you can go back to the original news footage, if you can find it, and see what that context was. We were talking earlier about clips of videos and having just a 1-minute clip. It might be real, but what was happening on either end? What did that person say before and at the end? And so sift. You need to sift through the noise. You can do it.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a lot of this really is just news consumers can't be passive anymore. Right. There's a lot of information. The media ecosystem is very disparate now. I mean, you really have to know where you're getting your news from and take the time to understand if something is real or not.
Right.
Yeah.
But also be aware that you're not always going to have that time. So even if it's just not sharing something that you see that is, because if you have a tendency to be emotional about something, say, oh my gosh, this article is terrible, I want to share it with everybody, just pause. Because even if you don't have the time to investigate, that's enough.
Yeah, I forget who said it, but one of the people that I read as I was preparing for tonight said, wait 7 minutes. Give yourself a 7-minute cool down period before.
Take some deep breaths
before you hit share, and that should go a long way to sorting some of this out. Great. So thank you to the panel. I want to open up to questions now. I'm hoping people have some questions for us. Oh, great. Let's go over here. Gentleman in the row. Third row.
Yeah, a number of times you've mentioned that basically we've had fake news forever, but one of the fundamental differences seems to be that now much younger people are seeing the fake news than they were 20 years ago. When I was a kid in my late teens or 20s, I just didn't come across the same amount of fake news that my daughter is coming across now.
You know, if I could, I will note certainly that there have been multiple. The one, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but the vast multiple studies looking at browsing, looking at Facebook, looking at Twitter, it would seem that the vast disproportionate share of fake news is being consumed by people 60 and older. So it's like I said, I'm not sure that should make us feel better. But that is sort of the demographic. I mean, that's actually one of the few really robust things we know, which isn't to say that young people today, if you're making the comparison to you may be 100% correct that young people today may be getting exposed to more misinformation than they were 20 or 30 years ago, because we actually don't have a great comparator there. But if we're looking cross-sectionally today, you know, the vast bulk of certainly the fake news kind of information, and there are other kinds of misinformation, it's primarily 60-plus-year-olds.
But I also want to say that there's a difference in the kinds of ways in which platforms deliver that news. And so people who tend to get stuck in echo chambers on Facebook, you know, once you click on one thing, the algorithms on these websites are designed to watch you move across the website. Sometimes they track if you just hover over a thing, right? Or if you're the type of person that reads with the mouse, it's tracking all of that and how fast you scroll to get a sense of, well, what is it that are they dwelling on? Dwell time is a metric that they use. I'm sorry, they track your eyeballs sometimes. There's a whole thing out there.
You're being watched.
You're being watched.
Yeah.
But the other thing, though, that we haven't addressed here is the platform of YouTube, right? That is a huge search engine. People start there. Young people start there, and it is my most generous way of saying this is it is a cesspool. Right? But every once in a while, if you need to fix a carburetor, it's very technical, right? If you need to figure out how to do something technical, yeah, you can fix your Keurig, whatever. But we have to address that kind of misinformation and disinformation, especially when it's both the kind of web-based website impersonation stuff, along with these other more new media platforms that people are making a lot of money off of creating those kinds of disinformation.
Well, and the related
channels.
Videos that I have a 10-year-old who has discovered YouTube, and I've watched her interact with it and then click, look for a specific video and then start clicking through all those related videos, and it is so quickly gets into a place that I don't want her to be, and I think that. That's where those algorithms and how they're manipulating people's user behavior is really scary. And aside from completely avoiding it, watch your kids.
Well, this is what I tell people with their kids. Remember DVDs?
Yes.
They still exist.
Yes.
Pop one in.
Yep.
That's it. You know what's coming up. It's not going to surprise you.
Great.
So you
yes.
talked about fake news on social media, but how about mainstream media? We have a president who says the New York Times is fake news.
Yeah.
Big drink of water right here. Propaganda is real, right? We know that. State-sponsored media is real. The state has a vested interest in communicating the wrong information at the right time. Same with other manipulation campaigns. Reporters, again, have to do diligence, and sometimes the reporters are up against a clock that's set by their editor. Sometimes they're up against a clock that's set by social media, who says this thing is about to erupt, and if you're not first out the gate with marginally true information or as true as you can make it article, you're going to get left behind, because the first few minutes of a story breaking, that might be your most open field for getting your article picked up, because people aren't going to click on the 10th article about pictures from, especially recently in our social media and in our media world around what's happening in Iran. There is a lot of information out there. There's a lot of fake pictures out there. There's a lot of context. And so reporters, their guards have to be up, but at the same time, we are in a situation where there are no usual gatekeepers like there had been traditionally. This problem of the last decade, which has really kicked into high gear over the last 5 years, is something that's going to be with us for a while longer. And then we will have to establish new media gatekeepers, new trusted and vetted sources of information. And journalists have to learn to react less as well. They have to exercise a bit of that flinching mechanism to say, well, why am I even seeing this? We see a lot of our media manipulators that we study, they're constantly trying to get in front of low-tier journalists. So journalists that are publishing on sites that are not as widely celebrated as the New York Times. But the idea is if you can get one story into the media and then someone newsworthy retweets it, you can what's called trade up the chain. So media manipulators might target even small-time travel blogs to try to get information into the media ecosystem to then move a story through to mainstream media. And so the mechanisms are actually quite sophisticated.
Let's go over here.
I just wanted to give two quick reactions on that, because one is an important one, which is a major problem with our news ecosystem, is the president, right, who is a recidivist source of misinformation, right? And that then ripples all through the news ecosystem and what people search for and what people believe. And that's a problem that we're seeing at a level that we have not seen before in contemporary society in the U.S. The second is that sometimes the news media do fail in major ways. What would be the biggest, the most damaging in terms of mortality source of misinformation in the U.S. over the last generation, say? Of health misinformation. In terms of mortality.
Vaccines.
Okay, so the answer, my answer, would be the opioid crisis, right? And the vector for that was substantially through trusted institutions. It was through doctors who were being seduced by payments and by information that they were getting, and it was through the news media. You can read stories, including in the New York Times, that were propagating the storyline of Purdue Pharmaceutical around how OxyContin and other kinds of modern opioids were not addictive anymore. They were without much danger, right? It did not match the science of the times and so of what we knew at the time. And so the news media, including the New York Times, failed in epic ways in terms of its treatment of the opioid crisis. So there are times that the news media has been because of its credibility, was an incredibly damaging vector for misinformation.
Let's go over here.
So this sort of picks up on that point. I've been around for a while and remember the Willie Horton ad and Mike Dukakis that was credited for playing an important role in defeating him. The swift boating of John Kerry in 2000. And so it seems to me that the only difference between now and then is social media. And so shouldn't the focus be more about social media, whether we should control it or not? How do we deal with it? Rather than false information being communicated, which has always been a problem.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
So the one thing, when we talk about controlling sources of information, that is a dangerous slope to go down. We have problems with social media and sharing of misinformation and disinformation, but there are also parts of it that are helping marginalized communities connect with each other. For example, during the Ferguson issue challenges, Twitter was one of the only places you could get information about what was happening because people on the ground were on Twitter sharing. And I worry that if we if anybody says, okay, we're going to try to control what's happening on social media, that means that we're going to start silencing voices that have only just now found a platform where they can exist.
So one thing that we have to balance with that, though, is that you can also pay to play, right? You can pay to set up fake accounts. There's an entire search engine optimization industry of fake accounts, seasoned accounts, Instagram followers, Twitter followers. All of these things are designed to mimic social movements in a lot of ways, mimic organic activity, mimic interest in order to manipulate the platforms. We have to make that illegal. We have to. Like, that is not free speech in the public interest. And so that, to me, that industry and that way in which social media and the way in which it's structured in order to deliver information to you is fundamentally flawed and broken, and we must take out the ways in which people can pay to play. And that includes investigating and thinking through, well, what are these digital advertising systems that allow you to target market people? It's such a fine niche that you know almost everything about them, including when was their last anniversary, right? And in order to target market them, right? There's all these ways in which they can get at your information, the buying and selling of people's information, the segmented audiences, in order to enrage you, right? Someone might even pay to promote that tweet that was upsetting to people who are, say, known progressives, known liberals, people who are fans of Elizabeth Warren, for instance, are a segmented audience that you can send messages to, right? We have to look at that. We have to understand what it does, and we have to think differently about what those rules are going to be around advertising and engagement.
Let's take one more question from the back.
Hi, just a different dimension I have a question about. There's an assumption that everybody's on the same wavelength, and there are some bad actors who are putting out disinformation, or some people who are just communicating information that's not correct. But the way this was explained, I heard, was that you have, like, in the old days, you had every village had an idiot, but everybody knew who the idiot was. Now, with social media, every village idiot from every village can get together and form a very strong social media group. But they're still just, a very small group. But I don't see a solution for this, because you get on Twitter, and every day you'd think the world is ending until you turn it off and you realize, no, that's just on Twitter. So how can we deal with this, or are we doomed?
Well, I want to say that the internet enables various kinds of collective action of spatially separated people. Now, we can think of this of people, let's say, who have rare diseases. There might be a disease which only one person in each village has, and they might have been very isolated in the pre-internet world, and now they're enabled to learn from each other, to organize, to find cures, to lobby, and so on. And so that's the miracle of the internet, and there are many examples of that. But on the other hand, you're right, also. So we see the fringes of society that are able to enter the collective discussion in certain kinds of ways. And sometimes we say, that's great. And sometimes we say, that's awful. And part of the interesting question, and I don't have the answer for this, is how do we deal with enabling like the rare disease scenario without suppressing, while suppressing the village idiots. And like even the targeted advertising, if we didn't allow targeted advertising, there are definitely certain kinds of niche groups that would be unable to collectively organize or get their word out in ways that may not be great for society. And so it's difficult. I wish I could say here was the magic bullet, but I actually also think it's not. The story may not primarily be about the village idiots. It may actually be the more positive one and the positive side. And so I don't want us to all, go home and like give up. I actually think that there's actually a lot of bathwater and there are a lot of babies.
Yeah. I think that's a great note to end on. I want to thank everybody for being here. Just so you know, we've printed out the SIFT infographic for you. It's outside on the same table where you can sign up for the Thread, our weekly newsletter, and learn more about the Forum Network. I can't say enough about how great the Forum Network is, especially if you want to go behind the headlines and get more context to all the things that you find online. And I want to give a special thanks to Annie Streffler and Lauren Joe, who really made this event happen tonight. Thank you. Yes. I also want to thank our panelists, David Lazar from Northeastern, Christi Farrar from the Mass Library System, and Joan Donovan from the Shorenstein Center. Yes.